Welcome to another tutorial here. This time, we're going to be taking a look at the very first step in character creation. What I'm going to be doing today is creating a proxy mesh. Now, a proxy mesh is meant to be a stand-in, something that we can give an animator and a rigger so that they can continue along their work while we continue along working on the character. This way, they're not forced to wait for the character team to finish their work, and they can start doing what they need to do. This is going to be something that is proportionally the shape and size of our character, and we'll do a good enough job for the purposes of getting some very rudimentary animations created and to get those into a game. I've opened up ZBrush here, and I haven't yet done anything. This is a clean slate, and I'm going to do a few things in order to start creating this. So the first thing that I'm going to be doing is I'm going to be creating a ZSphere, and we're going to be using a ZSphere to generate the geometry for our proxy. Over in the tool palette located on the right, I'm going to click on the simple tool or the simple brush tool, and inside of the menu that opens up, I'm going to go and select the ZSphere. Once done, I can click and drag on my screen to place a ZSphere anywhere in the canvas. Now, before I do anything, and this is really important, I want to ensure that I turn on edit mode. This is located up in the top of the toolbar. This is going to ensure that we can then rotate and move around our object. This is going to place the object into 3D edit mode and pick it up off the canvas. Now, this sphere is going to serve as the pelvis for our character, and the reason that it's serving as the pelvis is that it's the first sphere that's created. And in terms of the hierarchy of the human body, everything kind of roots out from the pelvis here. So the pelvis is going to act as a root for everything else. The legs will grow out of the pelvis, the spine will grow out of the pelvis, and then everything else will grow out of the spine. So for that reason, this is going to be the first sphere created. Another reason that this is important is that this is also pretty close to the center of mass on a human being. And so it kind of makes a little bit of sense that this is going to be the first thing that we create. Now that I have this done, I'm going to go and turn on a few settings inside of ZBrush in order to allow me to use some proportions that I've worked out ahead of time. I'm going to open up the palette on the left, which is currently empty in my version of ZBrush. And I'm going to grab my draw palette. I'm going to go and turn this on. And then using the little icon in the top left, I'm going to click and drag that palette over to the empty slot. This will dock it on the left so that I can use it a little bit more easily now that it's kind of there and in the open. It's still available under the draw menu and you can go use it there. I just find it a little bit easier to have some of these options available to me here on screen. Once I'm done with that, we can always go and close that tablet or that palette, and this will go away and go back to its default state. The next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to turn on the floor in the rendering mode. Now, this is both available in the menu on the right-hand side of your viewport and also inside of the draw palette. It's a little icon called floor. Now, in this icon, you'll see that when I click it, we get a floor then displayed on screen. And if you look at the very top of this icon, you can see that there's an X, Y, and Z button. And these will turn the floor off and on. If I hold Shift and I click on the X, Y, or Z, it'll turn on the reference plane for each of those sections. Now, I'm only going to use the ground plane here. The other ones will actually get generated automatically for me once I go and put my reference image into the scene. Now, you'll also notice that I am not in perspective distortion mode. This means that we are looking at this orthographically, and if we go and look at the plane here straight on, you can see that it kind of looks very bizarre in that you can tell it's rectangular, but it's not disappearing into the perspective as we would expect it should. And this is going to be important once we start creating the rest of our geometry here from our ZSphere. If we have perspective on, we're going to be creating a distorted human figure, and we don't really want that. And so I'm going to keep perspective off. That way we can actually see straight through to the background plate once it's created. In the draw palette, I'm going to go and head over to the section where we turned on the floor, and I'm going to drop down to the area that says front back. Now, there are 4 little buttons here: front, back, up, down, left, right. and modifiers that we can kind of play with in order to put some images in the background and modify them for our viewport. Now I'm going to use the front back, which is going to allow me to load images for the front and back. And these are going to serve as essentially our blueprints for a human being. Now I've prepared these ahead of time, and so I have an image here that I can use. I'm going to go to import, and I'm going to go to my projects, my female base, and I've got a back plate here. And here's the image that I prepared ahead of time. So I'm going to go and bring this in. And you can see that when the image is brought in, there is a ground plane that has dropped down. Now this was the same ground plane that was at the bottom of the sphere. But now since the reference image is here, that ground plane has dropped down to the bottom of the image. Now, as I mentioned, this is going to be my pelvis for my character, and you can actually see, because of the center of mass and where my drawing is here, that the sphere is pretty close to where we want it. It's not exact, but it's pretty close. Now, I have both images in a single, or both dimensions, the front and the side of my character here. I've got them in one single image, and I do this just so that I don't have multiple images that I'm juggling on my hard drive. Though it's, completely up to you. If you want to have two images, you can do that. I'm just going to use a single image, but what that means is that it doesn't align automatically. My sphere is in the center of the world. When I created this ZSphere by dragging it out, that aligned it to the very center of the world. And so my image is offset. So what I'm going to need to do is I'm going to need to use the horizontal offset here to shift the image over until it does line up with the sphere. Now, if I go and zoom in here, I can see that there is a grid that is being generated. This is actually on top of that image plane. As I said before, we get the ground plane here, but once we add in a front back image, our Z plane appears. And so that's what we're looking at here. And I can use that line, as very subtle as it is, to line up the image that I've created here. So I'm going to go into my horizontal offset, and if I just click and drag this, I can get it to line up a little bit closer with what I want. So something about there. So now the ZSphere is where it should be in the image, or rather the image is where it should be in relation to the ZSphere. And that's going to make it a lot easier to create the rest of the anatomy. Now, there is another bit of a problem here, and that is that you can see we can't actually see the image through our ZSphere. The ZSphere is completely opaque, and our base plate, or our reference plate, is behind it. And that means that we can't see through it. So I'm going to have to make some changes to the way that the geometry is rendering. This is another reason why I have the draw palette out. Inside of the draw palette, in the section where I've gone and loaded the front back image, I'm going to simply go up to the top and hit this little button called front. And that is going to allow the reference planes to draw in front of the geometry. Now you can see the geometry is still in front, but it's gotten a little transparent, allowing us to see through it. Now that that's done, I can actually continue and create some more of the geometry. Now, I am going to want to put my side image plane in here, and this is going to be essentially the exact same process. So we'll minimize our front back. I'll open the left, right, and the one that I want is actually going to be on this side here. So I'm going to go to map 1, import, and I'll choose the same image, and that'll put it over on that side. Now, again, my sphere is properly positioned. My drawing is over in the front, and so I'm going to use the horizontal offset again to bring it back and get it a little bit closer in place. Now, one of the issues we're going to encounter as we start creating our geometry is that while using Z-spheres, the only shape we have available to us are spheres. This means that nothing is going to line up exactly the way we want it to. If we look at the only sphere we have so far, the one created for the pelvis, you'll notice that it is not wide enough to actually be her pelvis. But if I look at it from the side, it's too wide to be her pelvis. Now, this is because the pelvis is not actually spherical, right? It is not a perfect sphere. And as such, a perfect sphere is going to have a hard time becoming that shape. So at this point, all I'm really interested in doing is just nailing proportions. This means I don't really care if it's going to be very close or not very close, and I just need to pick one to get accurate. And once we get into our geometry editing mode, that's when we're going to make it better aligned to the proportions of the individual here. So I'm going to go and hit my scale tool, and I can go and scale this little sucker up until you can see it's just starting to line up a little bit better with the image here. Next, I'll go to draw. And before I draw anything on my sphere, we're going to take a look at the cursor here and how it changes. So currently the cursor is red, and you can see that as I approach the center, it turns green. Green is an indication that the tool I'm about to use, or the draw mode that I'm about to use, is going to snap to that axis. That means in the YZ plane here, it's going to snap to the center. Once it's red, it's going to be off center. And you can see that that occurs on each axis here. Once we get near enough to the center, ZBrush will realize that we are trying to create this dead center, and it will change the color. Now, because the human body is symmetrical, and specifically this character that I'm going to be making is symmetrical, I need to turn on symmetry in order to create both sides at the same time. To do this, we can go into our transform palette, and we can activate symmetry. Now I'm using X symmetry, which if we look at our little gizmo over here is the red, and you can see that I now get two cursors that appear on my mesh, and when they turn green, they snap into a single cursor, indicating again that we are on that center line, and it'll only create one of what it is that we're trying to create. I'm going to start by creating her torso and the remainder of her spine. So to start, I'm going to rotate down so I'm looking above this. I'll snap my cursor until it's green, and I'll click and drag. And while I'm dragging, I'm going to add Shift on the keyboard. That is going to snap the sphere to the same size as its predecessor or parent. This means that it's going to be identical, and we're going to get something that looks like a capsule. In the side view, I can go and move this up until it lines up with the top of her shoulders, somewhere about here. And that is going to be the stand-in for her torso. Now, she does have an hourglass shape, as this is a female character. And if I look at her from the front, we can see that there's a little bit of an hourglass here as well. So I'm going to return to draw. And this time I'm going to click in the middle of the two spheres. When I do that, it'll add another sphere of the same dimensions as the other two right in the center. Perfect. This will allow me to create that hourglass shape. I can return to move, drag it up, scale, and drag it until it's closer in proportions to her physique. Now again, we're at a point where we don't really have all of the tools available to us here. It looks decent from the front, but in the side view, we can see that she's a lot wider than she should be. Again, this is something that we are going to edit down the road, and I'm not overly concerned about now. Again, the only real goal here is to pick one of the dimensions and go with it. Now, in the case of the rest of her torso, it may make a little bit more sense to go with the side view, as that's a little bit thinner, but I need her pelvis to at least be this wide in order to generate both legs from there. Now let's go and make her arms. I'm going to return to draw. I'm going to go to the side, and I will click where her shoulder is and create a sphere about that size. Because symmetry was on, it created a sphere on either side. And we can just go and line this up with the image a little bit better. And then go and click another sphere below that. I want to make sure I put this one on this sphere. This is going to be her wrist. Now, I could go and make the elbow, then the wrist, and the hand, and so on. However, since I want her arm to be planar, I want to make sure that it is in a good position to create the elbow. It's a little bit easier to do that by not going through each of the joints along the way. In fact, I'm not only going to be creating spheres for the joints, but I'm going to create a sphere at the midway point as well to try and get a little bit of the shape of the arm correct. So in order to move this sphere down to her wrist, there's one important thing we have to do. Currently, my cursor is so large that when I place it over the sphere, I'm actually grabbing both spheres, the shoulder sphere and the little wrist sphere. So if I hold the space bar down, I can actually drag down the draw size so that only that wrist sphere appears inside of my selection. I'll go and drag this down. That way it's down where her wrist should be. And then like we did with the torso, I'm going to go to draw. I'll insert an elbow. I'll insert one for where the deltoid ends and her arm thins out. And then I'm going to add one for the thickest part of her arm inside of her forearm. I will go to scale, and I will scale down the first sphere that appears inside her arm. I will scale down the part of her arm that is where her elbow is. And I will scale up the bit of her arm that occurs in the forearm, or that is located inside of the forearm. Next, I will use move, and I will just position this down a little bit so that the meat of her forearm is actually below the center line. Now I'm going to be creating her arm at an angle, and in fact this drawing was created with altered proportions from the front here to ensure that that angle actually exists. Her arms are a little shorter than they should be, and that's because when you see her from the side here, her arms are bent. Now if we look at her from the side, we can see that that's not actually the case. Her arms are not actually bent. So using the rotate tool, I'm going to go and click on the area between the two spheres below where her elbow is, and I'm going to rotate this until her elbow is out. Now again, I can see that there are some inconsistencies here in where things are. Now that I've rotated it, it doesn't appear to be in the right place. So we're going to use our move tool, and we're going to go and reposition these so that they do occur in the right area. Now, in doing this, you can see that I've at a point where I'm going to be breaking my arm. If you get to a point where you have a sphere that is not contributing correctly, using draw with Alt held down will allow you to remove a sphere. Now, I can position her elbow correctly in the two views, both front and side. As well as place her wrist correctly. And once I have that, I can go back to draw, create that sphere again, and scale it up again. We now have her arm in a decent position. Now it's going to look a little bit funny. Again, her torso is way larger than it should be, and her arms look like little tiny toothpick arms, but that's okay. We're going to correct this once we start creating the rest. I'm going to head back into the top view, and I'm going to create another ZSphere. This one is going to serve as the base of our neck. So I'm going to go move it and scale it until it matches proportionally the size of her neck. I'm going to make sure that it doesn't disappear inside the sphere. You'll see that if I move it too low, it becomes concave. And what that's going to do is it's not going to create geometry, but it's going to create a hole. I'm going to bring her torso down a bit in order to be able to get this sphere exactly where I want it. Again, you can see we're missing some of her neck muscles here, but that's okay. Next, I'm going to go and create another sphere. Again, this time holding Shift to snap it to the previous size. I will bring this up and forward. The neck has got about a 15-degree forward incline on it, so I'll go and place that in. And then this one is going to be goofy as well, but we have to put a sphere in for the skull. And so I'm going to try and match this to the skull, at least the main cranial mass here at the back. And I'm not going to worry too much about the front face. I just need to get the proportions right. So I'm trying to get something that lines up with the shape of her head. And again, because we're dealing with a sphere here, it is going to work from one side, in this case the side, and not work from the front. But again, I'm not concerned about that. It is just proportions I'm worried about now. I'm going to go in and scale these spheres down a little bit. I think I would prefer them to line up to the side view and not to the front view. I think this is going to make my life a little bit easier And so I'm going to line this up and line this up and line this up. And again, we'll just go and move them forward until they match a little bit better. Now, again, she's going to be really off here in this angle, but that's okay. I'm going to bring this up until it lands where her crotch is so that it's in the right place. And I think this is going to work a little bit better. So let's go to draw and let's put some hips on here for her. Now, I held snap and I probably shouldn't have. We'll go and scale these down. And these are going to act as the insertion point for her hips. Now, if I just make her leg out of that central sphere, I've now gotten it so small that it isn't going to line up with where her leg should be. So I'm going to go and create this sphere as kind of an insertion point for the hip. And if you look at my drawing here, you can see that that almost lines up to where the insertion point of the femur is. And so we're getting pretty close to where we want things. Looking at her from underneath, we'll repeat the process of creating her arms. So in this case, creating her ankles, much like we did her wrists, scaling them down until they line up with the thickness of her wrists or her ankles, making sure they line up from the front and from the side. Now I've got my character with her feet spread to be directly under her shoulders, which is one of my preferred modeling poses. I find that gives me enough room between her legs. If I were going to be creating jeans or something that meant to be a little bit baggy, it gives me the ability to model in between on that clothing without her legs interfering with the clothing. I'm going to return to draw and we'll add a knee. And we'll look at this from the side and I will go and make sure that that knee is forward ever so slightly. Again, giving her just a natural bend in the leg. We were going to go to draw, and I'll add the center of the femur and the center of her calf. And then we can go and move these. So I'm going to move her femur forward, and I will head over to scale and bring that up a little bit. And we'll scale the calf up as well. And I think actually, whoops, that's the wrong tool. We'll go into move, and I'm going to go and place this where the thickest part of her calf is here, along with bringing it outwards. Now you can see her leg actually gets quite a bit thinner than where her ankle is here. So I'm going to go and scale this down again. And again, I'll just be aware of this so that when I do my sculpting, I'll have to go and correct that. So we're going to go draw here again, and I will create yet again another sphere underneath. And her foot is a big wedge, and I'm not going to be able to create that wedge directly in here. So I'm just going to kind of do my best to create the closest thing I can to that wedge. I'm going to bring this ball out to about where her toes would begin. Something like that, and we're going to go to move, and I'm going to move it inward just a little bit. I want her feet to kind of point out just a little bit, not completely forward. And I'm going to be putting toes on this character. I haven't yet decided who this character is going to be. I'm working purely just on a base mesh here. And so if this was a character that was going to be wearing footwear, so let's say I was making a soldier that I knew would have big soldier boots on, I wouldn't bother creating toes. I would actually just sculpt what looks like a foot in a sock. That way the anatomy is correct, and I don't waste time on modeling things that I know I'm not going to need. But since this character doesn't yet have a predetermined future, I am going to put some toes on her. And so I'm going to go and put enough toes on the front of this sphere. And I'll have to put one more. I'm going to put the other one up here. It's not in the right place, but we're going to use the move tool here to go and reposition these a little bit until they are in the right place. Now, again, I would like to avoid, if I could, having them go internal. We'll go look at this from underneath. And I'm going to try and get them as close to one another here as I can, which should allow me to get that little pinky toe back where it should be, like so. And then I'm going to go to draw, and I'm going to just click on the front of each of these. And as I click and drag, I'm going to do the same thing I did before. I'm going to hold shift to snap this to the size of its parent. And then I can go and move them out until we get our toes here. So something a little bit like that. Go move this up a little bit more. Now, you can, if you want, at this point. Looks like I'm not quite in the right area here. Let's turn sideways. I'm going to look at my drawing here where I've worked out some of the anatomy already. It looks like I may want to go and pull some of these little guys out a little bit further. And you can also go, if you want to, in here and actually start creating the knuckles that you would get on your toes. And so on her big toe, she would get one, which I can kind of move up a little bit. So there's a little bit of an arc to her toe. And I know that the toe itself is actually going to be on the ground here. And while I don't yet kind of have this properly on the ground, again, the dimensions are not quite what they should be. This will kind of set me up down the road to have an easier time. So we'll add 2 knuckles to every other toe. So if you weren't aware of this, your big toe, pollicis, has a single knuckle, while the rest of your toes have 2. This is also the same kind of anatomical layout that you have in your hand, where your thumb is 1 bone short of the rest of your other fingers. And so that means there is 1 fewer knuckle in your thumb. So I'm going to go in and just place these joints in here. And using move, I'll try and get them to line up a little bit better with how I want her toes to be positioned. And again, I'm going to end up doing a fair amount of sculpting here, so I'm not overly concerned about the positioning here. It's just about getting the enough geometry into play so that when I do make her toes, there is enough there. Okay. So she's got some toes at the end of her feet. We need to repeat this process now on her hand. So I'm going to go to draw. I'm going to return to her hand, and I'm going to create a sphere that's a little oversized. Now, as I mentioned before, I've been kind of keeping as close to as I can the reference plate or the reference image, which is good. That's exactly what we want. However, I need to be able to place enough fingers along this. And if we go and look at this guy from the side here, it does match the side view of the hand. And so that's what I'm going to do. I'm going to treat this almost as the width of the hand, and not so much the depth of the hand, or how wide the hand is from the side here. I'm also going to try and place the knuckle side of the hand down so that at least that's correct, and the only thing I need to correct afterwards is the back. Now, I've seen some artists that will go and create the carpal bones out of the wrist directly, but I don't use Dynamesh, and so in creating a singular mass here, I will have a singular mass, which is exactly what I'm supposed to have in the hand. And I won't have to worry about merging and welding things together later. And so that's why I do things this way. Now I'm going to go in and place the joint for her thumb up here. And this is going to need to actually be a little further back than where I've got it, which again is going to create a little bit of an interesting shape. And then I'm going to go and create the tip of her thumb. And we'll go and move that here, and that singular knuckle, which goes in between. Now, it's important here to note that I am using my my cursor at a very small size here. I'm not over extending things in terms of the shape of this. And the reason for that is that I'm going to need to manipulate smaller and smaller joints. So I don't want to have this massive cursor that's getting in the way. We'll create the 4 fingers. And once that's done, again, I'm going to go and place them, much like I did the knuckles of her feet, and try and line them up. In this case, I'm not happy with the size that I got. You can see that there's a mismatch in the scale of her fingers here, and so I'm going to go and just line them up a little bit closer to what I want, with that middle finger being just a little bit larger, the ring and index being pretty close to the same size, and then that pinky being just a little bit smaller. Once done, I will, again, like I did with the toes, create a new sphere on each of the first knuckles, which I can then use my cursor to move down to the tips of where I want the fingers to go. And we'll reassess the thickness here. It's not too bad. It looks like that ring finger was actually a little thicker than it should have been. We're going to go and just pull it down a little bit. And I'll go back into draw and we'll create our 2 sets of knuckles for each finger. Once I have my knuckles in, I'm going to return back into the rotate tool. And I'm going to want to try and give these a little bit of an arc here so that they bend the way fingers do. Now, it's important when you do this that you try and line up your camera with the angle that the finger is on so that you don't break it. I want to make sure that these fingers, you can see that the index here is now curling a little bit towards the middle finger, and I don't want that. And so I'm going to try and give them enough room here. You can see it a little bit better here. And try and keep them as aligned as I can so that they won't cause too much problems when sculpting. I'll head into rotate here. I'm going to go into the back and we'll pull that pinky in like so. And I can see that that did get distorted quite a bit in its rotation. So I'm going to try and angle this out here a little bit and get this a little bit closer. And then we'll do the same thing here again. Those look okay. I'm going to rotate, and again, I'm going to try and line this up as perfectly from the side as I can. And we'll bring that finger in as well. Just a little bit of a natural curl to the fingers, I find is going to give us a much better setup in the end. Now, I've gone and created anatomically all the bits and pieces that I need, with a couple of exceptions here. So obviously, she has no face. There's nothing here that is going to be used to create the dimensionality of her face, the thickness, her nose, any of the features that are there. There's no ears as well, which is another issue that's going to crop up. Her shoulders, you can see I'm missing that trapezius muscle in the back. Based off where I've put her chest muscle, it's kind of gone and distorted things a little bit. Again, this was done to make sure that that neck was in the right place. She has no breasts, and this is, again, something that we kind of want to do. We don't want to add breasts to her at this point in time. And the reason for that is that the geometry I'm going to get right now isn't going to be perfect. It's going to require me to retopo this in a way that's going to give me some geometry that's going to be laid out a little bit better. Now, it's going to be decent geometry. In fact, everything but her head is going to be pretty usable. And the geometry that will arise from putting spheres on from her breasts isn't going to be exactly what I want. The other issue is that I want to make sure when I do my sculpting that I nail the dimension of her rib cage properly. And to do that, I'm going to do the sculpture without the breasts. I will just worry about that rib cage and the mass of her torso. And then once that's done, I can always add breasts to her. I'm not too concerned about that. If this is a character that is going to be fully dressed and we won't see any of the breast tissue at all, I don't even need to make the breasts part of my base mesh. They could be something that is just appended to this. But if she's got something low cut, in which we'll see some cleavage, then I am going to have to make some concessions here and attach those things together. So let's go take a look and see geometry-wise what this is going to give us. So to begin with, I'm going to turn off the floor. This is both going to hide the floor and our reference planes, so we can just see the ZSphere character that we've got. It, again, is going to look a little bit goofy and not perfect. And at this point, I would usually turn on perspective. Since we don't really see human beings outside of a perspective viewport, this is going to give us a much better look at where this character is. So I'm pretty pleased with the proportions here. It doesn't look too outlandish. I'm going for something realistic, and so a lot of the proportions that I've worked out in my drawing are present in this armature, and that's kind of what I'm after. Now, as I mentioned, what we are going to be doing here is generating a proxy mesh. That means we need geometry. That means that we need something to be able to give an animator so that they can actually begin their work and start animating. Now, to do that, we need to convert what is a ZSphere or metageo into geometry. And that's what we're going to be doing here. So it doesn't matter what you have selected. I'm going to go back to draw mode here. And inside of our tool palette, I'm going to head down to the area that's called adaptive skin. Now, this is going to be really important and is the one place I notice most people making mistakes when they follow through with this. And that is that a few versions back, ZBrush has added Dynamesh directly to the adaptive skin. That means if I were to go and zoom in on my character here and turn on the preview for the adaptive skin and hit Shift F or turn on the line fill, you can see that it is going to actually Dynamesh this character. Now, that could be fine if you're okay with Dynamesh, but this is inflating the polygon count larger than I really want it to be. And this is kind of one of the drawbacks of using Dynamesh. And in order for it to do a good job, you need a higher level of resolution. And that's not what I want. So I'll turn off the preview and I will zero out the Dynamesh resolution. And this turns it off. So if I turn on preview now, you can see that we are not treated to the Dynamesh topology, but we are actually using topology generated by each of the Z-spheres. This means that each and every Z-sphere we created is now generating its own color group on this character. Now, there is some good and there is some bad in what it's doing. There are some areas, like in the very center of the chest, that is not very concise. It's not very good in terms of that topology. What I would probably prefer was if these edges just went straight across and matched up that way. But this is what we're getting, and this is why we're going to do a little bit of retopology work in order to fix some of those areas that we're not overly pleased with. Another area is going to be in the back of the pelvis. And essentially kind of where we get these junctions is where things have gone off the rails. Now, if we go look at the fingers here, they're not too bad in what they've been, in how they've been created. You can see that we've got those initial spheres for the knuckles, which are kind of doing what we want them to do. But more importantly, we're getting these really nice topological flows for the knuckles. Now, again, if I look at this middle finger here, I can see that the center edge of the finger doesn't actually run all the way down the center of the finger. It kind of actually curls and goes around. And this is, again, why I'm going to do some retopology work once I'm pleased with the anatomy. Now, we're also not actually anatomically or polygonally, we're not done here because I can always turn the preview off and go back to the Z-spheres. And this is important in case you want to adjust the way that things are being manipulated. So if you don't like the way that the junction between the neck and torso is happening, we can always turn off the preview and go and edit that sphere and try to get something better out of it. But when I turn on the preview, it actually looks pretty decent to me. I'm going to go look down here at her toes and make sure that there's nothing very wonky. And no, that looks okay too. Again, it's not really the shape of a foot, but that'll come a little bit later when we start adjusting this. And for the most part, I'm pretty pleased with everything that this has given me. I've now got this kind of Q-tip character that I can give to an animator so that they can start doing their run. And for my work, I'm actually ready to start putting some anatomy on this. So before I can complete this, before I can be done, we need to get out of preview mode. Now, the way that we do that is we head up here into the top of the tool palette, and we are going to hit Make Polymesh 3D. When I click on this, you're going to see all of the colors in the polyfill or the line fill. We're going to see those shift. And inside of our tool palette, we actually now have two variations of this character. And when I select back and forth between them, you can see that our tool palette is actually switching between two different sets of options. This is because the one labeled ZSphere 1, which owes its name to that first ZSphere that we created, is still the ZSphere version of this character. The one labeled PM3D ZSphere 1 is the Polymesh 3D the polymesh that was generated from ZSphere_1. And so that is what that object is named. And this one, we can't actually get back inside of our ZSpheres. We are kind of locked in at this point. With that done, I'm free to go and save this tool, and I'm saving the polymesh version, not the ZSphere version, into a folder where I can continue work from this point forward. With that, we've hit an end of part 1. And in the next video, we will take a look at starting to adjust some of this geometry so that it better matches the character that we are creating, or the anatomical structure of the character we are going to create. See you then.